Ladies, are you interested in the interplay between hormones and relationship health? Well, I definitely am. And today I have a guest who I've interviewed before on Instagram, but this is his first time being my guest on my YouTube channel. His name is Dr. Michael Moeller. I'll let him introduce himself. Michael, would you please introduce yourself to the
Sure.
audience?
Yeah. So I'm a naturopathic doctor. So in the state of California and Idaho, I'm licensed as a primary care doctor. I specialize mostly in hormone replacement therapy. So not only am I able to prescribe pharmaceuticals, but I'm very well versed, and I work a lot with my patients working on diet and lifestyle. So for something as complicated and as fun as hormones, there's lots of levers to be pulled and lots of chemistry to be found out, as you know in your work, Allison. So, and pleasure to be here. So,
Yay! All right. So let's just dive right in with it, like a basic understanding of a woman's cycle, her hormones during the month, and then maybe from there we can go on to talking about how those times of the month might affect her relationship. And then also I want to get into birth control, hormonal birth control, and how that can affect a relationship. So I'm just going to listen, and I might throw in a couple questions. If there's something I don't understand, I'm probably going to raise my hand and ask you to clarify, if that's okay with you.
sure. And as I go through here, feel free to chime in with anecdotal things because ultimately, when we talk about hormones, I like to think about, I usually use examples of like drugs, unfortunately, because people can understand them a little bit better. So, for instance, like progesterone works on the GABA agonist, and GABA is a inhibitory neurotransmitter. So, for instance, you have a medication like a benzodiazepine or alcohol work on that GABA receptor, and they help with relaxation. So, to give some anecdotal things, maybe before we get into the cycle, just so you know what these things do. Progesterone is the progestation hormone, right? You need that in order to have a baby, right? And so you have that hormone, estrogen. You have three forms of estrogen. Estradiol is the most talked about. And when most people talk about estrogen, they're almost always talking about estradiol. So, right, when women have a cycle, right, we're talking about the menstruation, right? So day one is when the bleeding is happening, and first half of the cycle we call the follicular phase, and the second half of the cycle is your luteal phase. And in between that, you have your ovulation. So these things are important, especially talking about regulating mood, talking about relationship, and being self-aware in both men and women. And the other thing that's funny in women, we don't talk much about testosterone, but testosterone is also very important in women as well. But starting with the cycle, or first half of the cycle for women, I don't have a cycle, I'm a man. It's mostly controlled by estrogen. So your first day 1 to day 14. And what's really going on in that phase is you have a good amount of estrogen with very little to progesterone. So most women in this part of the cycle usually feel pretty empowered. This is like there's evidence that women do better in exercise and just going out and getting at it, right? Because estrogen is a hormone that, again, to give kind of a blank statement, is tied to emotion, like feeling. It's the volume of your feeling. Having too high of estrogen or too low of estrogen. And progesterone is more of a hitting the brakes. It's a relaxation thing. It's kind of slowing things down. Now, like with most things, though, like the gas and the brakes, there needs to be a good balance of that. And so in the first half of the cycle, most women, because they're only dealing with this one hormone, have a tendency usually to feel quite a bit better. And because there's not as much progesterone, they don't have as much as that slow down and reflect is usually what we think about. So, right, and then your ovulation comes around, and what's happening there is you're getting a spike in all three. And testosterone goes up. Testosterone, we think testosterone makes effort feel good. Testosterone makes you feel driven. It makes you feel motivated. It helps with the libido. And we'll chat a little bit about, in my opinion, the ratio of these things, because I really look at them like a symphony. So you get the ovulation, right? And if at that point there is a chance for conception, if there's intercourse, and then we go into the second half of the phase, which is your luteal phase. And what begins to go up then is your progesterone with estrogen together. And this is usually where women are a little more, kind of more reflective, right? Because that progesterone's kind of coming in and saying, kind of in that nesting, right? Like, hey, did I just become pregnant? Your uterus, the lining starts to thicken. It's ready for implantation. Your body's ready to be pregnant. It's preparing all things to become pregnant. And then obviously what ends up happening then, if there is no conception, if your luteus corpus, if you don't conceive, because if you conceive, then the progesterone and all those hormones continue to go up, right? And when that doesn't happen, and those that the hormones drop, and then that's when you have the menstrual cycle, where the body goes, okay, we're not going through this. And then you can get into debates on, what is PMS, right? My personal opinion, it's a combination of, it's the symphony. It's like all this music and then it just crashes. Yeah. And so it depends on like how loud your trombone was compared to your violin, compared to your drums or whatever. So dealing then with PMS, and then, maybe even getting into as women's hormones change. Also being introduced to, like you said, birth control, other endocrine disrupting chemicals that mimic estrogen. There's quite a few things to kind of try and tackle there. So kind of what I explained is usually in your ideal environment, right? You have your menses, your estrogen goes up, no progesterone, you ovulate, your body gets ready for pregnancy, it doesn't happen, and then it dumps. And then you get basically a crashing of that estrogen and that progesterone, and then you don't feel that good, usually, right? And your body's then like, all right, let's do this again. It's kind of like going up a hill. You're almost to the top, and then, okay, let's go ahead and start over. So hopefully that wasn't too in-depth, but kind of giving people a general idea as we kind of tear those ideas or pull them apart.
Why is it that everything feels so intense right before my cycle?
Yeah. Kind of like I was saying, a couple of things happen when we're dealing with women's health. Again, I think it's important to remember ratios more than number, right? And so you have a testosterone to estrogen ratio, you have a testosterone to progesterone ratio, and it's not like we can look at these things in isolation. And I'll just give you these are not lab numbers, but to give you a general idea that your estrogen can be 10 and your progesterone can be 5. So you go, okay, I have twice as much, right? And you can say that's an imbalance. You can also be imbalanced and have your estrogen be 100 and your progesterone be 50. It's twice as much. But you have then 10 times as much of the hormone. Does that make sense? So it's like the music, not only can it can not sound good because it's too quiet, but then the music can also not sound good because it's just too loud all around. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the tougher parts, in medicine, particularly with women, is figuring that out. Because the other thing that happens with women is the intensification most likely is due to your estrogen is higher at other points, but because the estrogen to progesterone ratio is higher, your body then has to detox those. So it also becomes more difficult. Okay. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like mixing, and I use drugs because people can understand, like if you mix alcohol with a medication or like a cigarette or nicotine, it has a way more substantial effect, right? So if you like just have a shot of whiskey, you're like, fine. But then if you go smoke a cigarette, you're like, whoa, I can smoke cigarettes fine. I can drink whiskey fine. When I put them together, it's too much. And then the come down is way harder when you come off of those things as well, right? So, and those hormones also do help you to feel good most often. Right. But it depends. There's ratios that feel good for some people and not for others. So it's pretty individualized.
Well, I know I feel great in the middle of my cycle. There's nothing I can't do. I have tons of energy. I'm super talkative. Like I just love connecting with people, and I'm just almost a different person. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, no, and it makes total sense because all these hormones, in particular, we usually talk about how they're playing on your neurotransmitters, is usually kind of how a lot of people will think about them. For instance, testosterone too is not as inhibited. Progesterone is going to inhibit both testosterone and estrogen. And, women too, we can get into deciding on modern women, modern men, and their hormone dysregulations. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on because we don't have data from 50 to 100 years ago. But I've seen plenty of women feel better. And, I've treated younger women who are getting off birth control. I've treated older women as they've gone through menopause and seeing what introducing a hormone does. And sometimes that's what you have to do is just try it out. For, one example, you probably heard the term estrogen dominance.
Yeah.
So the idea behind that is women have too much estrogen to their progesterone. And like I was saying, not only there can be way too much, but there can also be you have too little of both of them, right? You can have 10 estrogen, 1 progesterone. You could also have 30 estrogen and 1 progesterone. Like those are two different things in how they will present clinically. And then the other issue is when we look in our environment, we're exposed to all these things that mimic estrogen, like BPA in plastic bottles. So that goes into your cells and it hits the same receptors that estrogen would. So if you're complaining about a symptoms, PMS, and we're like, well, your hormones, and it's tough to measure hormones in women because it's 28 days and it's all over the place. Yeah. But those won't show up in your blood work because they're xenoestrogens. They're not actual estrogen. It's kind of like you're looking for a certain gang that's causing all the problems. And it's like, this is what the gang looks like. But it's like, no, it's actually a different gang that is doing it. So they have the same effect, but then it doesn't show up in the blood work. So it's another kind of tricky thing to take into consideration when we're looking at the hormones and how they're affecting them. So
I want to get back to talking about like hormonal birth control and how it affects relationships, because we talked a little bit about that on Instagram and it was so interesting. So can you explain what happens and when someone gets off of birth control, what can happen in the relationship?
Yeah, so two things like you were saying earlier, first half of your cycle towards ovulation, you feel very like, hey, let's get it. Let's get at it. I'm talkative. I want to be out there.
I'm very creative too. I'll think of like 20 projects I want to do, and I'm like, yeah, I can do this. It's no problem. And then later in the month, I lose steam. I mean, it's almost every month. I feel like I can.
Well, I'd be interested. Can you elaborate on that? And is this a pattern? Like, what are some of the things you see in women first half of the cycle, ovulation, and men's like mindset? I mean, do you have some feedback, and maybe I can plug some biochemistry in on that?
Well, the obvious one is just being more sexually attracted to a spouse, having more energy, being able to work out. Everything goes smoothly. Like there's not a lot of, in my marriage too, especially in the beginning of my marriage, the whole month would go very smoothly. We were in love. Everything was great. And then at the end of the cycle, it was just like that crash that you were talking about.
Yeah, and I mean it makes sense from a biochemistry, right? The first half of the cycle, you're in that, hey, let's get ready to have a baby.
Yeah.
Right? And then after the ovulation happens, it's like, okay, it's time to nest. Right. And I think that's when you want to talk about relationship dynamics, we can compare that to men. So, and I think maybe too, we can take a step back, right? Like menses when women, right? We have that just 12, 13, 14, whenever, and then it slowly peels off. And most often, in general, most of our hormones just go down over time. What I tell most of my patients, look, 0 to 20, we're growing, we're regenerating, and then 20 to, if you make it to 120, we're slowly falling apart. And so almost all of these hormones are slowly going down. Men, it's like 1% a year, whereas with women, you have menopause, there's a slow teetering, and then it's like, wham, it's like done. Right. And that's one of the differences too, I'd say for older couples kind of going through it, that I I had a couple yesterday. She's going through menopause, and he's older too, and they're trying to figure this dance out because he's on testosterone, so his libido is higher. She's going through menopause. There's not as much as of a libido there, so it can definitely be a dance figuring out. Okay, what do we do with this, right? And so with guys, you have this slowly going down. With women, it just it shuts off. And then also guys kind of have it where their testosterone raises in the morning and then slowly goes down. But what's interesting with that, and this is true in women, when we wake up, it's cortisol that like gets us up and out of bed. And most like sports records are usually broken in the afternoon or evening, which is you're like, well, that's weird. Your testosterone's highest in the morning. You would think that's when that would happen. But one of the leading ideas with that is that's the testosterone to cortisol ratio, because your cortisol drops by the end of the day. So, right, we have women who you're going through this monthly thing, and it's like, no estrogen, your estrogen goes up, you teak, ovulation, your estrogen goes back up, drops, where guys, it's more of a daily thing. And that's, dealing with hormone replacement, it's usually more simple with guys. You get their testosterone up and they're happy. Where with women, it's figuring out, okay, how do I up their progesterone in the second half of their cycle? But, talking about hormonal birth control and, back to your question about, well, what's it like in the first half? In the first half of your cycle, like you're saying, you're usually more motivated to go out, find a partner. If you don't have one, you want to have a partner, you want to nestle up, ovulation, you're ready to, get ready to conceive. So we've seen that in studies that women are attracted in the first half of their cycle to men who, I guess one of the easier terms to say is a little more assertive, a little more dominant. Like women are looking for a guy like, hey, that guy, and then I'm going to go get him, right? And then he's going to have I'm going to have his babies. Right. And then after you have, you're in your second half cycle, you want more of a nurturer. And not to saying that men can't be both, it can be something men need to learn, right? Everyone has their personality traits. But then it seems in the second half of the cycle, women want like, hey, first half of the cycle, I want you to go out and kill me a deer and bring me back some meat. In the second half, they're like, can you snuggle me and bring me a coffee or a tea? Right. So, and then we chatted about this depending on what kind of hormonal birth control that you use, but you're most often trapping your body in the second half of your cycle. Like your body thinks it's pregnant. So that second half just goes. So you're giving usually a combination. It depends if you're using you can use high amounts of progesterone, estrogen, and so what we found out about these women, and I don't have the studies in front of me, though, that they end up dating a guy, like you say, you're 14, 15, 16-year-old girl, which is not uncommon, right? Hey, you get on birth control because of your heavy periods, or your parents are afraid of you being sexually active and all that. And then you meet your boyfriend, and even if it's 16, 20, 22, 24, 28, whatever it is, you have to think about that. Like you're trapped in the second half of your cycle. You're going to prefer a guy who's probably very nurturing. Yeah. You won't be as attractive to as a guy who's as assertive. Doesn't mean you won't, like it's not there, but you're going to have a bias to that. And so it's important for you to know that if you're on birth control right now and you're dating a guy, we've chatted about that. Like, hey, you're on birth control. You've dated this guy for 2 to 3 years. You get married. All right, it's time to have kids. And it's like, I don't even want to have. I don't even be intimate with this guy at this point. So that has happened, and so it's something to think about.
I wonder how many women didn't even put that together. I mean, they didn't even realize it was because they were on birth control, hormonal birth control, when they were first together.
And it's funny because how many of us are very aware, like, don't talk to me until I have my morning coffee, right? Or there are people who smoke cigarette, like, I have to go take a smoke or whatever. Like these things, they definitely do alter the way that we perceive the world. I mean, like, I don't know about you. If I do a cup of coffee, like, I can run a whole lot farther. I can do a whole lot more work. And so I interact with people. I'll be nicer, or I have more energy. Yeah. And, we've only talked briefly about testosterone. That's becoming more and more of a thing in women because of PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. and they get higher amounts of DHEA, which can also raise their testosterone, and then they can get a little bit of androgen symptoms, like men, like they get a bit of a mustache grow, body hair, and testosterone really it increases your sensitivity to dopamine and serotonin. And in my opinion, testosterone it makes you more of who you are. It gives you more horsepower. Estrogen's kind of like this sensitivity thing, and testosterone is more of the umph thing. So both of them together are great. Like if you're a woman and you have high testosterone and high estrogen, you're gonna have a great libido. And if your progesterone's just there enough to kind of inhibit you and deal with your stress, awesome. If any of those three get kind of goofed a little bit, though, you can definitely have issues. And that's the hard part when you get into mental emotional states. Like I don't like using, and I've never prescribed an SSRI. I do understand the idea behind them. Like you don't have any serotonin. And I have this more so in men. I treat, with hormone replacement therapy. It's like if your testosterone is low as a man, you don't want to do anything. I can't tell you how many men and women, wives, I've gotten good feedback. Like he's a different guy now, right? And it's funny because with women, we kind of see it throughout your cycle, right? You're kind of a different person. With men, it's like they don't have that. So you're like, oh, he's just lazy. He has no libido, no energy. That's just who he is. It's like, no, his testosterone's low. And we see that in men. There's studies showing the higher the testosterone is, then they're more likely to be caring. They're actually more likely to be. There was like one study where they had like an auction, and guys with higher testosterone gave away more money because it's coming from a place of they're more abundant, right?
Well, and it makes men feel good to give and to do and to produce and achieve and solve problems, and so that's interesting. So a man with low testosterone is less likely to have those masculine qualities that actually feel really good to a man to do something with.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think I'd have to see if I can't find the paper. One of the leading indicators, actually, though, of how high a man's testosterone is how much testosterone his mom had in the womb, right? So, like, what was her hormones like, and what was he exposed to? And I think we chatted about that last time, talking about hormone health. It's funny because, like, the egg that we came from was all in our grandmas, right? So then you get into this idea of, being orthodox. I don't like getting too much into woo things like emotion or generational trauma and all those things. But it's actually biochemically true that your grandma, helped form the egg that is you. So what hormones or things that your grandma was exposed to and your mom, it definitely does get passed along to you. On top of all the environmental stuff, then we get exposed to as well. So the long-winded answer to your question, in the first half of the cycle, women often go for a more assertive man. In the second half, they often go more for a nurturer. And then if you're on birth control, you're trapping yourself in the second half. And often women then come off and they realize, oh, wow, I'm not as attractive to this guy, versus being on birth control versus off of it. So that's a big recommendation, I would say, to most women out there. One, I don't think hormonal birth control is a good idea to begin with, but if you're on it, something to think about if you have a significant partner.
This just occurred to me. What are your thoughts on being magnetic to a masculine man if a woman is on birth control? Like, wouldn't it be harder for a woman on hormonal birth control to attract that masculine man because she's not in that phase that we were talking about earlier? Because I'm just speaking from experience, like I said before. I feel so magnetic in the first half of my cycle. It's not even a feeling. It's like literally people are much more magnetized to me. I don't know how else to say it. Mm-hmm. So would that affect dating, like a woman's odds of meeting the kind of like that provider masculine man?
Yeah, I think definitely when you look at again, it's almost always easier to use other, like caffeine, right? If you're more caffeinated, you're more likely to go out, you're more likely to talk to people. And I'm not promoting saying everyone needs to be on caffeine, but it's an example that I can use that most people can relate to. And I don't know if there's as much research being done in these areas. I can only talk from, anecdotal, and you probably even have more experience, especially with younger women, figuring out when are they motivated to do things, when are they not. I mean, obviously on your menstruating, it's a lot more difficult to go out and do those things. But I do think that from a guy's perspective, there will be things that, yeah, obviously it goes both ways, that when that woman in the first half of her cycle is like, go, 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 she's magnetized, she wants to flutter her eyes, she's more likely to, and again, I'd say in the second half, you're like, I don't want to do any of that right now.
Yeah.
I just want to hang out. Yeah. Right. So, and it's important, I think from a relationship dynamic, these things aren't chatted about. There are some more so derogatory stuff about, oh, she's PMSing, she's doing this and stuff. And I don't know how to, respectfully, it's like, yeah, she has no estrogen and progesterone right now. It's tough. It's funny, quoting my new age stuff. We did sweat lodges, and we went in, and sometimes we had women with us. And again, usually you didn't do that. That's a more modern thing. But it was funny because one of the women, I forget how they found out that she was, menstruating. And then the head shaman's like, hey, no. And she kind of gave the feminist go around, oh, you're being sexist, da, da, da. And he's like, no, sister, like your body's in this place of regenerating. You need to save your effort for that. This is not for you right now. Like, right. We'll go in there and we'll do this. There is a level of like, with the sweat, it is kind of like a prayer community thing. Like they view it as an obligation and like, hey, we will go in and pray for you, but it's funny because it's like, hey, your body, and this is, we can get into that. Like the modern work system is not designed, it's not designed for women. And that's why they're so good at work some day. Like they're 2 weeks, they're on it, they're better than everyone else. And then they might have a day or two where they blow up and they fall off because they're not, I would say their body's not designed to be doing that right now. Mm-hmm. It'd be like if I didn't have 3 days of sleep, like, yeah, I'm going to be a little more grumpy. Like I don't have sleep.
Yeah. I'm so blessed that I've been able to be self-employed my whole life. So I get to take those days off if I want to. Sometimes I don't notice it. Sometimes I can do my workout and be fine for those 3 days. And then sometimes I just want to lay on the couch for usually just like a half a day or a day. It doesn't knock me down or anything. But being able to be setting my own schedule for my whole life has been really, really good for me.
Well, and, say what you will about at least how modernity paints, previous society, the Handmaid's Tale or whatever that stuff is, versus like that balance. And you can say this, like, you work for yourself, I work for myself. Some days, today I was at my desk at 7:30. Yesterday I was at my desk at 9. And if I feel bad, I can go take a nap right now. Yeah. And that's probably how most of society, depending, what your job was. I mean, there's still other countries, they have siestas. Mm-hmm. We don't do that. I've heard plenty of people. It's funny when you talk about the monks in the monasteries, like they do that, like they wake up and pray and they go back to sleep and they wake up and pray, like kind of re-guessing this whole, we just sleep for 7 or 8 hours. Mm-hmm. And it's funnier too, because in older patients, they almost always just can't, as you age, you'd think you'd need more sleep, but they, plenty of them, they like, I can only sleep for 5 or 6 hours is what they tell me. So they're actually better off taking naps. Mm-hmm. And then that plays into, which we really talk about, is kind of the detoxification. So you want to talk about when you're menstruating, and again, there are different theories on this. I'm just kind of giving my 2 cents that, your estrogen, again, just to make fake numbers, goes from like 0 up to 250, and then your progesterone goes from 0 to 250. And then the first half of your cycle, let's just say you had 250 of estrogen, right? So you have 250 things. Now you have 500 things. So both of them, the estrogen's the same, but then your detox pathways have to get rid of all that. And that's the same thing I was talking about earlier with drugs. It's like you can handle a shot of whiskey, but if you do a shot of whiskey with a benzodiazepine and a Tylenol, you think about like detox, I think about like a sink. So not only, you can pour just way too much in the sink at once, right? I could just pour 5 gallons in, it's going to just overflow. And that can be the issue, is just putting too much in. But then you can also, like, it can be clogged, and then your drain can get clogged up. So if you're not sleeping well, in women too, getting your bowels is super important. You need your bowels moving, right? Constipation blocks everything up. It slows down the digestion. It slows down the movement and detoxification. So you get a lot of negative feedback loops with stress. Caffeine will increase aromatization. So that's where you convert testosterone into estrogen. And so there are other medications like that that can,
I didn't know.
and usually not too much. It depends. That's where I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of like genetic SNPs and the ability to create and break down hormones and neurotransmitters. But again, they definitely compound on each other, right? I mean, it makes sense if you've done alcohol the night before, your body has to detox the alcohol. It also has to detox the hormones that you're producing. And usually that's a very smooth process, just like you're pouring a cup of water in the sink every day. That's fine. It's going to go straight down. You throw 5 gallons in there all at once, and then your sink is a little bit clogged up, you're going to have double trouble. And that's probably, I think, one of the bigger ideas with PMS is you're putting all that stuff in there at once, and then you're not putting anything. So it's like your sink finally drained, and then there's nothing in there, right? So, and that's just, and then people argue is like, well, is the feeling because you have none? Is the feeling because you had some and now you have none? It's the same thing with menopause. People say, well, hot flashes, that's from the low estrogen. But I still think there's arguments to be made. It's more of the ratio with estrogen and progesterone than it is just one or the other. So,
And then as far as getting pregnant, we talked a little bit about PCOS. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. But a really fun anecdote, and who knows, this could just be synchronicity, but I like to think that it had to do with the work that my client was doing with me. But she had been trying to get pregnant for a really long time. And in working with me, we utilized some practices and skills and self-awareness for her to be less masculine in the relationship. So leaning back a little bit, not having to make all the decisions, trusting her man to make those decisions on his own and not competing with him, not arguing with him. I mean, we worked on so many things that allowed her to lean back, relax, receive, literally receive. And she got pregnant after, I think they were trying for at least a year or two. But it was just really interesting to me to see how I could even hear the tone of her voice change on our calls from when we first started working together to when right before she got pregnant. She was just softer, happier, just more joyful, trusting, not in her head so much, more connected to her body. So what are your thoughts on conception, fertility, and lifestyle? And again, talking about relationships, like in this marriage, for example, where she took herself out of the masculine role and gave that, started honoring her husband, like, you're the leader of the family, spiritually, financially, all these big decisions. I'm giving this to you. And then she got pregnant. It was just so cool. And I just wonder what you think.
yeah, no, there's definitely we say like microcosm, macrocosm. There's a reflection there. I don't mean to talk about men too much. What's interesting is they're usually a lot more cut and dry, but I can use them examples and we can extrapolate on women because women are way more emotional. But I use an example, and hopefully it's not too grotesque, for guys, because when guys are struggling with sexual stuff, and this will correlate over to women, I say, you're walking in the woods and you see a bear. Now, unless you're attracted to bear, not a very good time to get an erection. It's time for you to run. Okay,
Right.
Get out of there. And what's happening biochemically is that your blood vessels in your internal organs are squeezing up, and your blood vessels to your muscles and your brain are opening up because you're fighting or flight, right? And so the other example, like you probably heard, don't eat and then go swimming, because when you eat, the food is in your stomach, and your body's like, am I digesting now or am I trying to swim? And you get cramps, and it's just it's not a pleasant experience. And so what I tell guys is like, to be transparent, to get a good hard erection, you have to feel relaxed. You have to feel comfortable, you have to feel safe. And if you don't feel that way, if you're in this sympathetic state, you're not going to be able to perform. And on the woman's end, it's a little bit different because you have this, like you're ovulating, like it's coming down the pipe, like whether you kind of like it or not. But I think one of the more interesting things is that, like that first half of the cycle when the woman's like, I want you, I need you, like that helps that guy get out of this sympathetic. He's like, wow, she wants this from me. She's not a bear. He's not trying to run from you, right? You are the honey pot that he found, right? He's like climbing the tree to get to you, and he's like, I got the honey, right? Like, this is good. I sit, I rest, I digest. And the other thing that's really interesting, I think, is like what King Henry VIII, like he kind of chopped off, he had like divorced all of his wives. I think he even chopped one of their heads off because he couldn't get his son. And then they kind of science is like, well, it's actually the dad's fault because the dad has sperm, and the sperm has the X or Y chromosome, and that's what depicts, what's. It's not her fault that which sperm got to the egg, but then there's other research showing that the woman has an immune system, and the immune system is actually attacking the sperm, and it kind of, there's this idea of like it lets through one of these things. And so when you think about that whole thing that I said emotionally, I don't have as much data with women. But again, if she sees a bear, if she's like, I'm not attracted to this guy, I'm not comfortable with him, I do not want to reproduce with him, I don't put it past them that their body, it will fight off the sperm, like I'm not going to get pregnant. And you see that. I've met women, you've probably seen it too. They have PCOS with this one guy. They're with him for 2 to 3 years. They break up. They go find another partner. Their PCOS goes away. And I think women have that. With men, it's just kind of like on or off switch. With women, they have all these sneaky, like, emotional ways that their body, like, and again, they'll be like, no, I'm fine. I love him. And it's like, your body's not telling me that,
I knew a couple who didn't use any birth control their whole marriage. They were married for 13, 14 years, active sexually and all. And they got divorced, and each one now has 2 kids, like right away. They didn't even think they could have kids because of that 14 years, but now with their new spouses, they both have 2 kids immediately. It's so interesting.
Yeah, and it just speaks volume to in my opinion, the traditional roles that, kind of like what I was talking about before. If you have a woman and she's doing this whole 9 to 5 kind of boss, and again, I have women that can be very successful. My front desk is an all-star. Chelsea is awesome. She's way better at this than I am. I'm okay at talking to people. She can just... And now I say the same thing. When I was in school, I got dominated by girls on... like, all the girls in my... like, women, sorry, on the test, they were just better than me. They're awesome. With that being said, I think when they're focused in on that, I don't think their body is like, oh, it's time to have a baby.
Right.
Like, you're like, hey, I'm a doctor. I'm going through med school. I met that. I met girls who struggled with fertility through med school, and then they got out and then they had a baby. And how much of that is not only... It's funny because with your hormones and your emotions, for instance, with guys, there's a study where they watch their soccer team win, their testosterone goes up. They watch it lose, it goes down. And so that's why I think this is even probably way more intense with women, because women have the ability, I think, to, on both ends, make their hormones louder and less than men. That's, again, I don't have anecdote. That's just my experience in life, that women are able to drive those things up and down better than men. So I think that definitely speaks volumes, too, about how does that happen with a relationship. And so if you want to drive, and this is the other thing that, with women, like, there's nothing more than a man loves than to be, supported and not challenged. And like you're saying, when you get in that, like, boss girl phase, you're very much you're assertive and you're a challenger, right? You're like, let's do this. Let's get to work better. And your guy doesn't want to hear that. Your guy wants to hear, like, good job. Like, you're so awesome at this. Like, how can I help you? Instead of being like, hey, you did great, but you did this, and this wrong. Like, he's like, okay, she just gave me all this critical feedback. Like, she probably doesn't want to reproduce with me. Like, in my opinion, that's what's happening at the subconscious level.
Right.
Because she's judging. And in my interpretation, it's like that feedback is helpful. I think especially as a woman, that should be done before you're in the relationship, right? Like you look at him and be like, okay, I'm ready to commit. I'm in the relationship. That doesn't mean you can't give constructive feedback. Guys are dummies. Again, you have to write it all out for them. Like if you talk in metaphors, they'll never get it. But my experience with men, once you're in the relationship, it needs a shift into like supportiveness instead of challenged, right? And that's gonna and I think too that just speaks volumes of what is your, if you're challenging him, you're still nitpicking him and saying you're not good enough for me yet.
I don't know if you know this, but this is one of the main things that I work with my clients on is
Yes, I've seen.
communicating.
I'm speaking to the choir, and I'm giving you my feedback that I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Yeah. So to the audience, anybody out there who doesn't really know me yet, this is kind of a plug for my own practice because this is what I do. I help women authentically communicate their needs and desires and wants. So I'm not saying you learn feminine communication and it's like this script and now all of a sudden your man is like all like cherishing you and devoted to you, wanting to solve all your problems because now you've used this script. That's not what I do with my clients at all, but we do it from the inside. It starts within, and then the words that are expressed have the tone. They have, yes, the certain words, of course, but it's more about who she is as she's saying these words and share and honoring what she needs to say. If she needs to share a problem, she's going to do that. But as you said, she's not going to be challenging him, criticizing him, judging him, making him feel like crap, because men need to feel like they're winning. They don't want to feel like they're failures or they're losing, but a woman can still share what she needs without making him feel that way.
And they should. And most often he wants to. He wants that. What he wants, and right, that's, you've done this. Like when women a lot of times just need to express themselves. And he's like, what do I need to do? Right? Like you're at, especially if you have that, when I was in a relationship and she was working and she'd come home and complain about all the women. I'm like, do you want me to beat them up? Like, what do you want? He's like, no, I'm just here to vent. And I'm like, okay, like you brought me a problem.
Right.
Like, what do I do with this now? And I would ask that. It's just like, hey, is this a problem solving or is this a venting? Is this a, you need to release? Because then I'll know, right? Okay, problem solving, release. Cool. I'm just going to hang out. I'll just listen to you and then let you vent. If you want me to give you some feedback, I can. Just need to chat. Like, cool, I get it. You went through a stressful day.
Yeah, that's smart. Hey, we've already been talking for almost 45 minutes.
Yep.
So if the audience would like to leave any questions in the comments below, we could do a part 2. And now we're kind of getting into my wheelhouse of communication. So that would be really fun too, to do a whole talk about communication and how men receive women's problems, needs, and feelings and desires, and to get a male perspective. I would really love to have that if you wanted to come back and
I trust me, I talk about that with as much as anything else with the guys, because we're addressing the same problem from different angles. Ultimately your hormones will they're very much a catalyst to communication. You've known, right? Like the way that a woman communicates during menstruation, during ovulation, is going to be different. And again, I think it's important for women to know that too when a guy's going through a rough patch. And this is just, I don't know how to be nice. This is just one of the things that sucks as being a guy, that your testosterone is very much regulated by, your environment regulates your mood for men, right? So if you get dumped, you get fired, and you go through a divorce, then your testosterone goes down, your estrogen goes up as a guy, you get some belly fat, you don't go to the gym, you're depressed, everything makes you sad. It's definitely a negative feedback loop. And those can be modulated. A woman and a man can both help each other out. Like, again, as a woman's going through whatever half of her cycle, just be mindful of that, right? She's in the second half of her cycle. She's probably not going to want to go on a hike today. Right? She's probably going to be like, hey, let's go downtown and let's get a coffee or a tea, or let's go to a movie. Let's snuggle up a movie night, instead of like, do you want to go, on a hike or something more physical? And the little things like that make a big difference in a relationship, though. Yeah. Like, are we on the same page? The more you're off on the page, the more you're like, makes things difficult.
That's so well said and so important. So, Dr. Mike, do you like being called Dr. Mike?
I get, how would I say that nicely? Yeah, I get all kinds of stuff. Yeah. Doctor, I get, yeah, I've gotten, it's funny. Dr. Mike is probably the most easy and convenient one. There's just so many other Dr. Mikes. There's another popular one on YouTube. So
Dr. Mo. You like Dr. Mo, right?
that one isn't, there's only like one other Dr. Mo. There's lots of Dr. Mikes. So, but Dr. Mike works. I get Dr. Mike, I get Dr. Mo, Dr. Moeller,
Well,
Michael when we're off camera or whatever.
how can everybody find you who wants to follow you on Instagram?
Yeah. Instagram's fine. What is my tag? Did I change it? I think it's Dr. Michael Moeller.
We'll
I'm
put
on.
it in the description too.
Yeah, I'll usually I'll comment or whatever. Like if you throw these on YouTube, I have a YouTube channel as well, so you
Great.
can find me there too. So
Perfect. Oh yeah, I'll put all those links in the description.
yeah, we could, if you want to, we could do a live one.
That would be fun.
I've only done some with DPH, so I'd have to probably figure that one out. But
Yeah, that would be really fun.
yeah,
All right. Well, thank you again, and I hope we can do a part 2, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day out there.
you got it. Pleasure as always, Allison. I look forward to speaking again.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.